Hello class, welcome back to our big history review, periods 4 through 5. So whenever we look at period 4, we're looking at the 1800 through 1848. The reason those dates were chosen, we have the 1800, which is Thomas Jefferson's election, as well as 1848, which is the Seneca Falls Conventions, or the Women's Rights Convention. Now, this period is going to include the market revolution. That's kind of like the central focus, anyways, of this period, as well as an increase in democracy, several reform movements, especially those that were prompted by the Second Great Awakening, regional tensions that will eventually lead to increased sectionalism in the Civil War, as well as territorial expansion. I have this slide here to really show you guys the development of the political parties. Now, we talked last class about the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Now, this class, or this video, we're going to add on the Democrats and the Whigs. Now, the Federalists and Democratic Republicans are going to be the first political parties within the United States. They're going to form during George Washington's presidency on issues such as foreign affairs, what should America's role in the world be, Hamilton's financial plan, what should or how much power should the central authority really hold. Now, what we're going to see is that the Federalists are going to really lose power through the Alien and Sedition Acts whenever we have a lot of Federalists supporting a limitation on people's freedoms, particularly freedom of speech, and in turn, the Federalists are going to lose a lot of support. And then during the War of 1812, the Federalists do not support the war, and as such, the Federalists lose even more support from the American people. So we have a good about 15 years or so where the Democratic Republicans are the major political party within the United States, and their power is mostly uncontested. Now, during Andrew Jackson's presidency, we are going to see a shift, and which we're going to see two political parties being formed. One is the Democrats that support Andrew Jackson. They're going to be formed from that Democratic Republican Party. And the second is going to be the Whig Party that really form as opposition to Andrew Jackson. Now, the Whig Party is actually going to adhere to a bit more of the Federalist stance on some of these things, such as a stronger central authority, a national bank, money being spent to try to develop the economy, as well as favoring higher tariffs, while at the same time, the Democrats are going to be a bit more like the Democratic Republicans, in which they are going to represent more of the quote-unquote common and lower to farmer or middle-class individual. They're going to favor universal white male suffrage, which is going to be gained in the 1830s. Now, when I say universal white male suffrage, what I'm basically saying is that any white male within the United States can now vote regardless if they own property or not. And there's going to be expansion in democracy at this time. Democrats also generally wanted lower tariffs and generally supported Andrew Jackson and his presidency. So some of the big things to note. All right, guys, here's a timeline because this helps kind of illustrate these things a bit more. So we see the Federalist and Democratic Party eventually give way to the second two political parties in American history to really beef it out, the Whigs and the Democratic Party. And eventually we're going to see the rise of the Republican Party, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, as well as the Know-Nothings, which we'll talk about a little bit later as well. Now, early 1800s, big thing you guys need to know, Louisiana Purchase. We're going to double the size of the United States. To do this, Jefferson actually has to go back on some of his beliefs and stated beliefs that of a strict interpretation of the Constitution, and to actually make this purchase, he has to go back on some of those things he said to have a loose interpretation of the American purchase, a loose interpretation of the Constitution. So another way of saying that is, to do this, Jefferson had to increase the power of the executive branch. Although his political party tended to support a decrease in central power or a decrease in power to the federal government and an increase in state power. So we had to go back on there. But in the end, we see an expansion of the United States. At this time period, you guys have to understand and really put yourself in the shoes of what's going on, the context of what's going on. We have the birth of the nation. And after the birth of the nation, you have people still alive who wrote the Constitution, who created the government. And so when all these things, these issues are being brought forth and these debates are being brought forth, you have different ideas of how to handle them. And one way in which we are trying to solve some of these issues to really figure out what does the Constitution mean is by using the Supreme Courts, the judicial branch of the United States. Now, we have two major court cases during this period in which we are going to see an expansion of federal power, an increase. The first is going to be Gibbons versus Ogden. Now, that case is actually over interstate trade, but in the end, what we see is that the judicial courts basically say that federal government and federal power always trumps state government whenever we look at interstate commerce. So this is giving more power to the federal government. And then Mayberry versus Madison. Now, this is a tremendous expansion of the Supreme Court and the judicial branch's power. So this actually establishes the judicial review, which is the power of the Supreme Court to review rather a law or executive order, actually abides by the Constitution. Basically, that means that the judicial branch is giving themselves the power to determine the meaning of the Constitution. So some of these debates and some of these issues that are being talked about at the birth of the United States, well, the judicial branch just put forth and basically said, hey, we can solve these things. And that really increases their power. We're going to have the Second Great Awakening. Now, the Second Great Awakening is a revival of religion, and especially Protestant religion and evangelism within the United States. Some of the causes are going to be a rise in democratic and individualistic belief, the idea that the individual has the power and that the individual's thoughts and prosperity and decisions for his or her lives is more important than the overall society. And then rationalism, trying to make sense of the world using reason, and then changes prompted by the market revolution, which we're going to talk more about in just a second. So you have the Second Great Awakening, and then from the Second Great Awakening, you're going to see reform movements being prompted, especially abolitionism, temperance, women's rights, basically the idea of a religious fever within the United States that, hey, we should be working to make a better society. And from this idea that we should be working to make a better society, why don't we do that through temperance is the biggest one from this time period, and then abolition and women's rights as well. So these are just some terms of different innovations at this time period so that you guys can have this if you do not already have it within your study guide to help you prepare for your exam. The main thing that I want you guys to understand is we have different technologies and different inventions that are really changing the United States during period 4. Now we're going to have canals, railroads, steam engines that are really going to change travel, transportation, commerce within the United States, commerce meaning trade. In addition, we're going to have the telegraph, which is definitely changing information and communication, as well as different inventions such as the interchangeable parts, different inventions like the cotton gin and the spinning jenny that are really making mass production possible. And all these things are really combining to create a national economy, a truly national economy, in which different regions of the United States can work together, can trade, and can be interdependent in creating this real national economy in which everybody produces something and relies upon each other for that item that they produce, trading back and forth. Now, this is also going to create more social and geographic mobility as well as these inventions and these changes are going to make mass production really possible and the growth of factories during this time. Now, some of these national improvements that we have in this national unity was only made possible by the American system or an actual law that is going to be put forth to use federal funds in really developing the young United States is really going to be some of the cause of all this and really prompting this unity. We're going to have the market revolution. Now, whenever I say market revolution, I'm referring to the process of going from making things within the household to now having factories where instead of you making everything, you will go and work somewhere to make something. And when you buy your item or whatever good you need for your house, instead of going locally and buying it from somebody who locally made it, you could be buying it somewhere from a town hundreds of miles away that produced and then imported that item where you live. So the market revolution is really going to change the economy and the way in which people work and produce within the United States. Some of these impacts, urbanization is possible. In particularly within the Northeast, we're going to have factories being developed, and factories being developed means that these cities where the factories are now need people to work, and as such, we're going to see an increase in people from the countryside moving into the city to find work, which creates even more city and even more urbanization. So it's all a development and interconnected. We're going to see a larger middle class. Standard of living for some is going to increase. Now, we're going to talk about some of these effects of the Industrial Revolution a little bit later on in periods, but know that during the early 1800s is really whenever it begins. The Industrial Revolution, all of these effects of it. Now, working outside the home is going to increase, as well as factory work, which makes it possible to work outside the home. And then within gender roles in society, we're going to see the cult of domesticity. The idea that if you are middle class or upper class, that women should be confined into the private sphere within the home life. And it should be the male that has that public sphere to go out and make money. In particular, now that more jobs are available for men to go out and make more money. Now, if you were a lower class woman at this time, you would not necessarily adhere to the gender role of the cult of domesticity. In fact, a lot of times, lower socioeconomic class women are actually going to be even more involved in the public sphere because now more jobs are available to them outside the home. Although if you were middle or upper class women, it was a different story. Now, some of these internal improvements and some of these debates that are happening in the United States, such as should we have a national bank? Should the federal government be this powerful to establish one? Should we have higher or lower tariffs? Should we be protecting American industries? And then internal improvements, where should we really allocate federal funds? Should we be concentrated in one area? Should we tend to benefit internal improvements that would help agriculture in the South, for an example? You're going to have these debates, and from these debates, we're going to see an increase in sectionalism within the United States. Now, there's a lot of causes for the Civil War. There's not just necessarily one main cause outside of the issue of slavery itself. But sectionalism is going to be a tremendous cause for this escalation in tension, as you have two different regions being developed within the United States that have two different economies and two different ways of lives and two different ways of looking at the issue of slavery. You are going to have the federal government at this time actually step in on some issues to basically say that the federal government trumps the state government, kind of like the Supreme Court, but this time with the executive branch, such as the nullification crisis in South Carolina, in which South Carolina attempted to nullify or not abide by a federal law that pertained to tariffs and taxation. And Andrew Jackson, president at the time, is going to step in and say, well, South Carolina, you can't make that decision. If the federal government states that you have to abide and increase tariffs, then that is what you have to do. You cannot decide to nullify a federal law. And so that was the executive branch at that time. So not only do you see an increase in federal power on the Supreme Court here, but you also see an increase in power of the executive as well. We're going to have the Missouri Compromise. And the Missouri Compromise tries to settle some of the issues that are being prompted by this sectionalism. You have the issue of slavery, which is the biggest issue whenever we look at sectionalism. You have Southern elites defending it as the Southern way of life. We're going to have that cotton gin, and because of that cotton gin, now we have a device that actually de-seeds the cotton. And because we have a device that actually de-seeds the cotton, we are not now able to mass produce cotton in a way never done before. And as such, to mass produce and to actually put that cotton into a machine to do this, you need to have people to pick that cotton. So the cotton gin is really going to give way to the rise of the cotton kingdom within the South. And the basis of that cotton kingdom, the basis of that agriculture, is going to be slave labor. Now, the Missouri Compromise was an attempt to settle some of these tensions and to settle some of this sectionalism by actually stating that as long as we have an equal amount of free and an equal amount of slave states, as long as one slave and one free are always admitted to the Union at one time, then we will have an equal representation, at least in the Senate, and therefore people are able to support whichever side they want to and have equal power when making laws, and everybody's happy. And that's the idea, that these two sectional groups would both be happy with equal amounts of power in Congress, or at least in the Senate. It doesn't work. Now, we talked much more in depth about this months ago, and I'm sure you guys will remember a little bit. But the Missouri Compromise, while trying to de-escalate some of these sectional tensions that are happening, really backfires and does not settle. It's more of a short-term solution. And it's more of a, hey, let's put this problem on the side to have to deal with it later. And that's what's going to happen. All right, so a quick note of U.S. foreign policy as well as immigration and migration into the United States. So what you need to understand about this time is the Monroe Doctrine really defines the United States foreign policy as one in which the United States is going to try to exert itself as the major powerhouse and influencer of the Americas, North and South America, as well as the statement that European powers need to stop colonizing the Americas, that it was time for the Americas to have their own independent nations, and the leader as far as the major influence of those nations and major power holder of the Americas would be the self-appointed United States. We also have the American Indian Removal Act that gave way to the Trail of Tears during Andrew Jackson's policy. This is a continuation of a foreign policy with Native Americans in which the American government will create treaties, and then whenever settlers want the land the natives are on, will try to recreate or break a treaty. And if Native Americans try to oppose being relocated, then the United States will generally use military force to forcefully remove them. Now, the Trail of Tears is important for the actual scope in which different tribes are going to be rounded up and the distance in which they are going to be relocated, basically dumping them into a entirely different geography in which they do not know how to sustain themselves. There is a lot of suffering and a lot of acclimation that has to happen. And so due to the scope and size as well as the distance, the Trail of Tears is quite significant. Now, immigration. Mostly we're going to see Irish and German immigration at this time, some of the quote-unquote old immigration. Now, Irish are generally going to settle in industrializing cities, and particularly in the east, the northeast. Factory work, low labor work is generally what they do. Some of them did work on the railroad as well. Then we also have the Germans, and Germans are generally going to work as farmers on the frontier. So they're actually going to live and settle a bit more in the Midwest and a bit west of the Irish at this time. All right, guys. So there's a lot of expansion that the United States does in the 1800s. If you actually look on this map real quick, you can really see how slow the United States is gaining more and more territory. The big things to note here, though, is the Louisiana Purchase as well as the Mexican Cession. We've already talked about the Louisiana Purchase. We're fixing to dive into the Mexican Secession. So we've entered into a new period. This is period 5, 1844 to 1877. Now, 1844 is marked by the election of James K. Polk, which is a president who supports expansionist policies. And then 1877 is the end of Reconstruction. So this time period is really going to focus on some of the causes and the buildups towards the Civil War itself, some of the aftermath, as well as period known as Reconstruction, with some Manifest Destiny and expansion thrown in there as well. So Manifest Destiny. This was the belief, the idea that it was the United States God-given, God-ordained even, right to settle and live on territory on the American continent all the way from the east to that western coast. Now, this Manifest Destiny was built on a lot of different beliefs, but the belief in the white superiority at the time, that racist ideology, in particular Anglo-Saxon and Protestant culture and superiority or belief in that. And then individualism, the idea that an individual should be able to go out west and try to create a better life for himself, and that it's part of his individualism to go forth and try to manifest his own destiny. As well as a belief in nationalism. Nationalism is pride in one's nation. So Manifest Destiny, one of the foundations is going to be the idea that the United States is the greatest country in the world. And as such, the United States has and should expand and really have control over more territory as the greatest nation in the world. The idea of pride in one's nation, nationalism. And then we have an idea and a belief in American cultural superiority, in particular that Anglo-Saxon Protestant superiority, the idea that American culture is the best in the world and that American culture should expand. There are many political debates really focused on this issue at the time. Now, in the election of 1844, James Polk is going to be elected due to the fact that majority of Americans at this time are going to support Manifest Destiny, this idea that America should expand. Now, Polk is going to lead us during the Mexican-American War. The United States is going to win this war, and the United States is going to gain that Mexican or that territory known as the Mexican Secession, in which the United States is going to expand into towards or till that western coast. Now, a lot of this territory expansion is going to open up into other debates in American politics, such as the issue of slavery, such as Native Americans and Mexicans that are currently on those territories. Now, at this time, we do have an influx or an increase in the quote-unquote old immigrants, as well as some new immigrants during this period. We do have Chinese immigrants at this time into Western United States. Now, for some of these old immigrants in particular, we are going to see an increase, and as such, we're going to have an American reaction or increase in people really reacting against this increase in immigration. And that reaction was the nativist movement, was Americans uniting with this ideology that that immigration should be stopped, and that immigrants that are currently within the United States should have a limit on their power, in particular their political power. Now, some of this native ideology is coming from anti Catholic sentiments, in particular the Irish that are Catholic at this time. Now, there is a political party that is formed from this movement known as the Know Nothing Party. Now, the Know Nothing in the mid 1800s, they do gain a national president's national power. Now, the reason they're known as the Know Nothing is because aside from policies on immigration, if you were to actually ask a Know Nothing supporter what they believed in, a lot of times supporters of the Know Nothing Party would say that they know nothing. So they really gained that reputation and that name as the Know Nothing Party. Now, the Know Nothing Party never actually had a presidential candidate make it into the presidency, which shows you that they were not necessarily in the top two political party, but they were a third political party that did come into power at this time. Immigrants, especially those in cities, are going to actually settle in ethnic communities to help to preserve some of their culture, heritage, and language. And these ethnic communities are eventually going to give way into actual areas of cities that we have today that still form ethnic communities, such as Chinatown in San Francisco, for example, or Little Italy or Germantown. Areas where people of a certain ethnic group are uniting to try to preserve that heritage. At this time, though, a lot of immigrants are actually uniting in these ethnic communities too to protect themselves against people who supported the nativist ideology and to surround themselves with people who were similar to them, their strengths in numbers. Okay. All right. So now we are fixing to talk about a numerous amount of things that are going to lead us into the Civil War. But before we jump into that, I do want you guys to know this is kind of often overlooked, but during and after the Civil War, we do have a tremendous expansion into the West, because remember, the Mexican Cession just opened up the Western Territory to the United States. We are going to have federal programs actually trying to prompt people moving out west, such as the Homestead Act, that actually gave acres of land to settlers that would go forth and develop a land and settle it for a certain amount of years. Then they would actually be allotted that land. So the Homestead Act was to prompt people wanting to go forth, settle, develop areas, make a better life for themselves and their future descendants. Now, we are going to see the growth of the Abolition Party during this time. I want you guys to know that whenever we talk about the Abolition Party, there's no exact date in which, bam, that's when the Abolition Party is going to begin. As long as there's been slavery on this continent, there's been people who opposed that slavery. Now, during this time, that is going to increase and grow, however. Now, methods used by abolitionists really boil down into three major methods, as cited by College Board anyways. You have arguments being perpetuated by abolitionists that basically say that slavery is a moral issue and that God would not support slavery and that people need to stand up and oppose it because it is a horrendous institution. Now, an example of this is William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator, which was a newspaper that really put forth a lot of these arguments at this time. In addition, you have some abolitionists that are helping slaves to escape and gain their freedom. The best known example of this is the Underground Railroad. Now, the Underground Railroad operated, head was Harriet Tubman really leading this, in which we would see a system of networks of safe houses in which slaves could stay during the day in these safe houses and basically run from safe house to safe house at night and attempt to escape into a state where they would be free, and most of the time keep going into Canada so that they would have to worry about somebody trying to say, hey, that was once a slave, and bringing them back down south. But it was actual series of networks to help slaves to escape to freedom. And then we're going to see violence, outright violence. An example of this is the abolitionist John Brown in Virginia, who actually leads a slave revolt. This is known as John Brown's Raid on Harper's Ferry. Now, this revolt leads into violence, and another example of this violence is going to be Bleeding Kansas as well, in which we will see some abolitionists actually go forth and these differences in their support of the abolition movement lead to conflict. Now, within the South, slavery was defended. Now, a lot of these arguments were perpetuated by elites that wanted to maintain their power, but some of these arguments were believed by middle class and lower class as well. One of the ideas was that slavery was a positive social good, that slaves were taken care of, that they were happy, and that slavery gave them food and a place to housing or a place to exist where they would be protected. And the idea as well was that slavery was an institution that was protected as a state right in the Constitution. So this idea that slavery was protected and that slaves were happy is going to be an argument that is going to be perpetuated by elites to try to protect slavery. And then you have racist ideology. You're going to have, at this time, some essays being published in the South that defend slavery by actually stating that the European race was superior, and that this idea of white superiority, that people of African descent needed to be slaves so they could be taken care of, that they couldn't take care of themselves. Basically, racism was actually being published in essays in the South at this time by elites. This racist ideology. I want you guys to understand that since the dawn of slavery within the colonies, there's always been racism as an attempt to justify slavery. Okay, so we are going to see a string of proposals to try to resolve this issue. Whenever we talk about this, I want you guys to understand that this issue has been one since colonial times, since you've had certain colonies that allowed slavery and certain colonies that did not. You always had people disagreeing and fighting for one side or the other in American history. The Constitution didn't settle it. The Constitution really just pushed this debate or this problem off for future descendants to try to solve. Now, one of an attempt to try to solve this is going to be the Compromise of 1850, which pertains to that territory opened up with the Mexican secession, in which we're going to see a couple different parts, such as the idea of popular sovereignty, that people out west, whenever those territories are being formed into states, should have the right to decide for themselves if they want that state to be slave or free. Another part of this compromise was the fugitive slave law, or more strict fugitive slave law, in which slaves who had escaped into northern territories would be taken back to the South and back to their owners, and this would be federally protected, as well as California being admitted to the Union as a free state. Now, the end result of the compromise, Northerners did not like it, especially those who were avid supporters of abolition. And this helped to increase the abolition movement, and this also ended up in certain states up north just not abiding by the fugitive slave law, because as morally, many people did not support it, and as such, they just simply tried to nullify it, in which if there was an escaped slave, a northern state would not try to make any attempt to contact authorities or people within a northern state at all, basically ignored this provision. And as such, we're going to have a lot of Southerners upset about this and upset that the federal government is not making the states abide by the fugitive slave law. And what we're going to see is the Compromise of 1850 actually increases in more sectionalism and more tension between the two different sections of the United States. Now we have the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is another attempt to settle this. Now this act is really going to be because Stephen Douglas at this time wants to build a railroad through the Nebraska Territory. However, he needs that territory to be a state, so he tries to solve this issue for this territory to gain statehood by saying, well, we need to just allow popular sovereignty like we did out west for both Kansas and Nebraska. So what eventually is going to happen is that, number one, this overturns the Missouri Compromise of 1820 because Nebraska is above that, Nebraska and Kansas is above that Missouri line, as well as lead into Bleeding Kansas, in which we're going to have some people in Kansas who are pro-slavery and some people who oppose slavery. And people coming into Kansas, and particularly people who oppose slavery, coming into Kansas in an attempt to simply fill up the ranks of both sides so that whenever the voting took place, now you have a lot of people who are pro-slavery, for an example, and that whenever the voting for popular sovereignty took place, that would mean that Kansas would be admitted as a slave state. So because you had a lot of people traveling to Kansas to try to fill up the ranks for both sides, you're going to have a lot of people who are very passionate about this issue all in one place, and as such, violence is going to break out. And we call this historical event Bleeding Kansas. We're also going to have the Dred Scott case, in which the Supreme Court says, okay, I'm going to decide this once and for all. We're going to have Dred Scott, who is a slave who's trying to sue for his freedom because he lived in a free state for a time period. And as such, the Supreme Court is going to say no. In fact, the Supreme Court is going to go as far as to say African Americans are not citizens, couldn't even sue in court, that they were property, and that the federal government, Congress, had no right to try to regulate slavery in the territories, period. So the Supreme Court during the Dred Scott is going to come forth with a decision that is definitely pro-slavery, and this is going to make many Northerners very upset, and is going to increase the tensions between the North pro-abolition stance and the South pro-slavery stance, going to lead to even more tensions. Now we are going to see the Republican Party. Now the Republican Party is formed at this time. When I say Republican Party, I'm talking about the Republican Party that's still around today, in a response to everything happening. Now the Republican Party is formed on the issue of slavery, and that major issue is that most of the Republican Party has the stance that they want to stop the expansion of slavery. And as such, their presidential candidate is Abraham Lincoln. And so Abraham Lincoln runs on this platform known as the Free Soil Platform. You know what? Let me go ahead and underline this so that you guys can put this in your notes as well, if you don't already have it. The Free Soil Platform. So Abraham Lincoln ran on the platform that slavery, the expansion of slavery would be stopped, but states that already have slavery would, for his political belief, would be able to continue that institution. Now, even though Abraham Lincoln wasn't necessarily a radical Republican with this, and he didn't take a radical abolition response, his stance at the time was quite moderate. He wanted to stop that expansion, but wanted to give the southern states, or wanted them to be able to maintain their right to this horrendous institution. And because of his stance on this, even though it is quite moderate at the time, we are going to have a lot of southern states that downright oppose him because he's not pro-slavery, because this issue has just begun to be such tremendous the most debated about issue in American politics. And because of his stance, a lot of southern states are not even going to have Abraham Lincoln's name on the ballot. So you are going to have Abraham Lincoln, who is going to be voted and elected primarily because of Northern votes. And as such, many Southerners, Southern elites, are going to feel as if the executive branch and the federal government is opposing them and their quote-unquote way of life, which is going to be really the immediate cause of the Southern secession, because many Southern states felt as if their rights were being trampled upon, which is going to be the ultimate cause of civil war. All right, guys, so I listed this up here for you because these are all great things to know with causes of the Civil War. You guys know the main cause is definitely going to be the issue of slavery. All of these little things over to the sides, the Missouri Compromise, Nate Turner's Rebellion, the Great Compromise of 1850, these are all going to be events in American history that are going to really cause this issue to escalate into an all-right conflict, an all-right war, which is the Civil War. I do want you guys to know that while we have these events that happen that lead to this escalation, the underlying cause of the Civil War is going to be sectionalism. The fact that you have two different regions within the United States, primarily because of the market revolution, that have developed into two different economies. One is agriculture, and the basis for their economy is slave labor. One is manufacturing, very industrial. And you have not only two economies, but you have two societies. One is very much more diverse than the other. And then you are also going to have two different ways of looking at the issue of slavery being developed. Northern, Northeast, you're going to have people come forth and an increase in abolition or support to oppose slavery. While in the South, as that is happening, you're going to have more and more people uniting in the argument that is the Southern way of life. So the main cause of all these things is the fact that you have two different regions that see this issue in two different ways and defend it two different reasons, two different economies, two different societies. And this sectionalism is going to be the underlying cause, of course, along with the issue of slavery. Now, the Civil War. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time. Emancipation Proclamation is definitely important. We talked about this in class. I know a lot of students, their eyes kind of glaze over, but let's just break it down. The emancipation, to emancipate means to free. Proclamation means to state. So together, the Emancipation Proclamation is a statement that slaves would now be free in the Confederate States of America. Now, the impact of this, honestly, the Emancipation Proclamation is a very strategic move on Abraham Lincoln's part. It does a lot of things. It changes the purpose of the war, because the war is no longer about uniting or keeping together the Union. It is now, the main issue is now about slavery. In addition, this is going to increase many African American slaves to run away and join the Union Army, as well as the reason it's very strategic is because this is going to really keep Europe from joining the South and for siding or aiding the South. You guys remember the American Revolution, one of the biggest reasons the United States was able to win was because the French came and they helped us out. During the Civil War, Lincoln did not want a repeat of, well, this territory wants independence, they're going to get help from a foreign party. So by making this the issue, by making this war an issue of slavery, he was helping to keep those European countries that had already abolished slavery in their countries out of the war and stopping them from wanting to side with the South. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation is very important. The significance is right up there with the Gettysburg Address and the way in which it's going to unite a lot of people behind to support this war, and the 13th Amendment with its significance. Now, the North Union is going to win. A couple different reasons, mostly because of leadership, not only Lincoln's at the time, but some military leaders. strategies that were quite effective with using advantages of the North, such as the Anaconda Plan. If you guys remember, that was the plan to squeeze out the South and make the South unable to gain resources. Therefore, they would eventually just give up. If you don't have resources to fight a war, you will not be able to continue fighting a war. So cutting off the resources is the most effective way or most effective strategy for winning a war. And then March to the Sea. Sherman's idea to simply cut through Georgia, burning everything in the military's wake in an effort to decrease Southern support for the war. If the common people in the South did not want the war, then the war would not persist. That was the idea. A couple of key victories, but really at the end of the day, some of the biggest reason the North is going to win is simply the fact that they have manufacturing power, they have more resources, as well as much more people. So if we look at the war and why the North won, the longer the war was going to draw out, the more chances that the North is going to win. If the South had any chance, or the Confederate States of America had any chance of winning, then it was going to be a very fast war. And that's just not what happened. The Union was able to be successful in the end in uniting the United States back. Now, some important things to note. The 13th Amendment, 1865, this amendment is going to abolish slavery. Now, I want you guys to know that just because slavery is abolished doesn't mean that life is going to really change in many ways in the South, unfortunately. We are going to see sharecropping that is going to start after slavery is abolished, because you have a lot of freedmen that needed work, that only knew how to farm, as well as you had landowners that needed people to work on the land. And because of this, we are going to see those freedmen actually exchange their work and property owners allowing them to work on their land if they pay them back. But what happened was they eventually became in debt. And so politically, on paper anyways, freedmen have more rights. But if we look at it economically, not a whole lot has changed right after the Civil War. We're going to have radical Republicans, Northerners who want more than just the abolition of slavery. They want to see equal rights for African Americans. And while during Reconstruction we see this push, what's really going to happen in the end is they're not terribly successful. Two major reasons. Number one, Reconstruction is going to end in 1877. And in addition, the Southern elite push towards limiting the rights of African Americans during this time. Now, whenever we talk about Reconstruction, if you guys remember, we're talking about the time period following right after the Civil War, in which we see an effort of the federal government to reconstruct or build the South back into the states joining the Union again. This is what we generally call Reconstruction. Now, I do want you guys to know there was some success in Reconstruction, such as freedmen actually gaining seats in the Senate and representatives, positions of power in Congress, basically, to create laws. But in the end, that is going to be definitely limited, and we're fixing to talk about that. So the 14th and 15th Amendment are important at this time. The 14th Amendment is going to extend, so I have the 13th that abolished slavery, the 14th that grants citizenship to African Americans, and the 15th that actually grants suffrage. When I say suffrage, it's the right to vote. Don't forget that, it's important. And the 15th Amendment is going to grant all males within the United States the right to vote, regardless of race. Now, I can't remember if we talked about it already or not, or I mentioned it, but whenever the Constitution was written, the only people who could really vote were white male property owners. And then around 1830, we're going to see that changed to male and white. So taking away that property owning requirement. And then after the 15th Amendment, we're going to see white being taken away too. So now it's just males. who can vote. Now, generally, next period, we are going to see this give way to the women's rights movement, in which you guys know we're not really going to see suffrage gain for women until 1919, which actually is passed, I believe, in 1920. But anyways, because of these amendments, we are going to see a couple of things happen within the women's rights movement at this time. We're going to see some of the women's rights movement supporting these amendments, and then some actually not supporting it by saying that that women should have been gained the right to vote before all males within the United States. In addition, though, the abolition movement and the success of this is going to enable a kind of network, and this is similar within all reform movements. You have people who are uniting for a similar cause. And then once you have legislation or laws being put forth to give the people what they're fighting for, well, then something else, they unite again for some else cause, or maybe one of the leaders of that abolition movement decide, well, hey, we need to unite again to work for African American rights. And so then you see a group that was united for one cause that still have those networks of communications that whenever they want to continue a freeform movement, they have those connections, they have those communication, and those channels already open and available to them because they were united fighting against another reform movement. So all these reform movements generally add up to increase networking, and a lot of times for middle class women at this time who were some of the leaders in all this. Now, other impacts of the amendments, I want you guys to know that in the end, Reconstruction is just, it's not successful in gaining more rights for African Americans. We're going to see the Supreme Court actually support segregation with Plessy versus Ferguson, that idea of separate but equal. The Supreme Court is going to uphold segregation and make segregation legal in the South, as well as we're going to have violence within the South, the KKK lynchings in an attempt to terrorize freedmen into not using their newfound rights. In addition, we're going to have political tactics such as poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, in an attempt by white elites to limit the newfound rights of African Americans. Poll taxes, making it where if you want to vote, you actually have to pay a tax to do so, which is very hard for the lower socioeconomic class, because if you can barely provide for your own family, then you probably are not going to be able to pay to use your right to vote. So it definitely targets lower socioeconomical individuals, which were freedmen were at this time. And then you have literacy tests, which this actually directly most of the time targeted African Americans, minority groups in the South. A lot of times you would have African Americans take these tests, and you guys remember, if you remember, I showed you a literacy test in class, but you would have African Americans take the test, and it didn't really even matter what they put down. The person reviewing the test was generally going to say they were denied the right to vote because they were, quote unquote, illiterate. So that definitely targeted African Americans, as well as the grandfather clause definitely targeted African Americans as well. The idea that for some of those poll taxes, as long as your grandfather voted, well, then your family already paid the tax, therefore you will be able to vote without paying a tax as long as your grandfather did. Which, of course, before the Civil War, there were not any African Americans that were legally able to vote, and so the grandfather clauses directly targeted African Americans and denying them and limiting their newfound freedoms. So one thing to note, though, which our curriculum doesn't actually cover period 8. Period 8 is so interesting, though, so it's kind of a shame. But I do want you guys to know that even though you have this limitation of freedoms and you have a Supreme Court that is working against the people at this time, in period 8, in the future, after World War II, we will see the Civil Rights Movement, and we will see a Supreme Court that actually uses these amendments amendments, the 14th and the 15th in particular, as a basis for expanding African American rights. So this is a tactic that we will see that really changes in the future. All right, guys, I believe that is everything. Hang in there. We are almost done. Do you realize this is period 4 and 5? You only have 2 more periods after this. So stay with the class. Finish this race strongly. Remember, you got 1 study guide and 1 45-minute practice exam every week. Sorry for the technical difficulties with College Board. I'm hoping we do not have a continuation of those difficulties next week. I'm guessing it's because a lot of people around the world are on their servers and they probably just cannot handle that capacity, but I'm sure that they're working on it right now. So hopefully by the time you guys take your practice exam later on, that'll be ended. Those problems will. All right, guys. If you have any questions, contact me. Do not hesitate. Any problems at all, okay? Be safe.